Hello, I'm John Reeder with the Healthy Schools Network. We have over 260 registered participants for today. I see the numbers not up that high yet. I'm going to wait for just a moment. But again, my name is John Reeder with the Healthy Schools Network. We welcome you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be in this great country. We will start in about 30 seconds. Okay, once again, this is John Reeder, Executive Director of the Healthy Schools Network. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in this country. Today's webinar is called Resilient Schools, Preparing for Extreme Weather, Dislocation, and Trauma. The the Healthy Schools Network hosts National Healthy Schools Day every year. And in 2025, the theme was climate change, resiliency in the effect on schools, and preparedness for schools. National Healthy Schools Day is usually held in April, but hurricane season is upon us, and we thought it would be timely to host this webinar with some true experts in climate change, adaptation, and school resiliency. The question today is, are schools prepared? Our panelists will help answer this question and provide suggestions for you, practical, actionable suggestions for you to help your schools prepare. Before we begin, I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the presentations from today and additional resources provided by our panelists will be posted at www.healthyschools.org. And we will also put the current list of resources in the chat later in during the webinar, so you can see what the resources are. But that will be a live page that will be updated, including the webinar recording itself. Now, let me get started. Brian Kasher is our featured presenter today. Brian is a nationally recognized expert in environmental health. He's waving there. Thank you, Brian. With decades of experience working directly with schools to improve building resilience and staff training, he will be sharing actionable insights from the field and offering planning models that schools can adopt now. Joel Scheraga, wave Joel, with the scenic background of Ireland there. Joel is an old friend of mine from the EPA. Joel was really an institution there. I was not. I'm so proud to have Joel join our webinar. He recently retired, and he's a leading voice on climate adaptation and public health, and he played a pivotal role in the EPA and administration-wide efforts to help states and communities prepare for climate-related risk. Finally, Dr. Leslie Rubin is our moderator today. Dr. Rubin is a developmental pediatrician and nationally respected environmental health advocate. He directs the Southeast Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit and co-leads national research on climate, dislocation, and children's health. We're grateful for having Dr. Rubin guide our conversation today. And with that, I am now turning it over to you, Leslie. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whichever part of the world you are. I'm going to be talking to you. Can see it, right? It's
yes, yep.
Children's Environmental Health. I'm at the Morehouse School of Medicine, by the way, Southeast Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, and Break the Cycle of Health Disparities, Inc., which is a nonprofit addressing children's health disparities. I just say nobody's responsible for what I say. It's all my own work, and I'm not going to benefit financially from anything I say. I just want to mention that children's environmental health is a field within pediatrics, and the little book on the right was the first edition of the book on pediatric environmental health, which was 1 inch thick and 400 pages. The fourth edition is 3 inches thick and 1,200 pages. And a children's environment is not just the immediate presence, but it's chemical, physical, biological, and social. I also want to mention that children are much more vulnerable than adults because they tend to have a higher metabolism. They breathe more air, eat more food, drink more water for their body weight, and therefore, whatever pollutants there are in the environment, they get a bigger dose. They get a bigger dose, and their bodies are not very well equipped yet to deal with many of the chemicals they may be exposed to, and they can't get rid of them as quickly. So the chemicals tend to stay in higher concentrations. And also, their organ systems are growing and developing. So whatever damage there might be to an organ system, it lasts longer and can last well into adulthood. And of course, children are small, young, can't need adults to nurture and protect them. So they're vulnerable in that way as well. I also want to comment that not all children are the same. There's an element called health disparities, and health disparities are as defined by those health differences that are linked to social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. And what is disadvantage? Disadvantage generally relates to poverty. So if we look at children who are poor, they tend to live in poor neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods have older houses. The older houses are in poor condition. They may have lead paint, so the kids are more likely to be exposed to lead paint. Lead causes brain damage. They do less well at school. They also have poorer air because of traffic and because of poor heating and air conditioning systems, so they are at greater risk for having asthma. And asthma is a pretty serious childhood illness that results in missing school very often and missing going to the emergency rooms in hospitals. They might live in unsafe neighborhoods where there's a lot of traffic and pollution and litter and limited access to healthy foods, limited access to green space, and greater amount of crime and drugs. And so they get caught up in violence, and they also have less amenities, so they cannot move around as much, and they tend to gain weight and more likely to be obese. Also, their schools are older and in poor condition, and their teachers are tired and not very well paid. And so the kids don't get as good education as their counterparts in the more affluent environments. And so they're less likely to graduate from high school and more likely to be unemployed after school, and therefore perpetuate the intergenerational poverty. So this is a very big issue among children's environmental health. Let me put that into the context of climate change. And as you know, climate change is this rapidly warming planet we're on, which is pretty scary. You just have to go out on a day like today and realize that it's very hot. And the red part on your right side of your screen is the temperature that's increased over the past half century dramatically. Now, when it's hot, the areas of downtown that are hotter, they're up to almost up to 10 degrees hotter. And who lives in those environments? Usually poorer families live in crowded urban environments. So they're exposed to greater amount of heat. And as you know, we enjoy going into air conditioned environments, and they may not have air conditioning because air conditioning is expensive. And if they're poor, they may not be able to afford air conditioning. And then they suffer from increased heat. We also all suffer from increased extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, freezing, storms, hurricanes, cyclones, wildfires. These are affecting us to a greater degree, as you can see in the more recent half century. This is just from last year, 2024. There were 27 major climate disasters, each of which cost over $1 billion. So this is also economically very draining, and it's getting worse, as you saw from the previous slide. So what's the impact on children? The impact on children is that there's heat stress, risk of dehydration. Dehydration can result in death, particularly in infants who may not be able to ask for water. Or you know who else is sports, kids and adolescents who play sports in the afternoon. They might not drink as much as they need to. They also are more and land up in the emergency room. They also don't. They also have climate change also increases the spoils the air quality and increases the asthma risk, which can dramatically increase. And as I mentioned, kids who are poorer live in poorer environments are more likely to have asthma. So they're also going to land up in the emergency room more. Increased weather events, disasters, they can risk injury and death and drowning. And you just heard this very tragic story of this rains in Texas that really devastated girls' camp, and so many kids died from that. So not only do they risk physical injury, but they also have emotional and psychological stress, anxiety, insecurity, post-traumatic stress disorder. And in a survey of kids, high school kids, middle school kids, where they expressed feelings about climate change, they expressed that they were worried, disappointed, scary, warm, upset, sad, scared. So this is a very big issue in kids' mental health as well as physical health. So the dehydration, asthma, injuries, and mental health concerns. So what is our role in this? Is to make sure that we become aware of these environmental factors in children's health and development, and that in a very thoughtful and sensitive way, we develop practical strategies to protect the children from climate disasters, climate change, from heat. And then we also address their mental health with helping them to understand what's going on, helping them to realize that there are things that are being done and that they're going to be safe and protected by the adults in their world, their parents, their teachers, and other responsible adults. The kids say their future is in our hands. So I leave this message with you that we may not be able to complete the task. We may not be able to do everything that needs to be done, but we're not permitted to desist from undertaking the challenge. Thank you very much, John. So we move on to our next speaker.
So Brian is up next, but Leslie, I just wanted to interrupt and invite everybody to use the Q&A function to submit questions that our moderator, Dr. Rubin, will tee up for the panelists. But the questions can be entered anytime. So go ahead and enter questions, and we'll keep track of those, and then we'll address them later in the webinar. All right, Brian.
For being here, everybody. It's an honor to be able to present this material to educators, education leaders from around the country. The material being presented today has been out for some time, but typically fire departments, police departments, emergency responders have received this level of training. And while it's always been available for school personnel, we've had to seek it out. I myself had to seek out special training through Texas A&M and others. And the information being presented, I want to make it clear, emergency response, resiliency is something that's going to remain. I don't think we need to be worried that the administration is going to leave us in a situation where learning Chinese is where we should be headed with our education system. I just don't believe it. Resiliency, disaster response has always been something managed at the state level. The feds have funded it, but they haven't really directed it. So what I'm going to be getting in today is in two parts, really. The first part's a little bookish, where we'll talk about different types of hazards and things that are out there and kind of how to prioritize our existing resources, as well as develop budgets or resource requests to help support our resiliency programs. And then I'll move into a second part where we take a look more at what it's like. More and more of us have been involved in responding to, say, ever intensifying natural disasters that are happening more regularly these days than ever. But I know a lot of folks haven't. And as you know, in North Carolina, hurricanes often come to the eastern shore. But in this case, most recently, Helene was hundreds of miles inshore. We had hurricane, 1,000-year rain event, hundreds of miles inshore and inland. And it's something that we had no idea was coming. And yet, more and more, these oddities are becoming every day. We see them every day on the nightly news now, if not weekly. So we'll go ahead and move into it. I'm having just a little bit of internet issues. So the slides will be run from away from where I'm at to make sure we keep it going. And I'm going to go ahead and turn around here and ask that the slides be shared from, I believe, DC at this point. Okay, as we get going, I want to give a shout out to Phantom Strange, who is a musician and DJ in Asheville, who actually composed the music that was on the 15-minute film precursor to this webinar during Helene. While Helene was taking place is where that music came directly from. So today we're going into the ABCs of planning for school district resilience, how and what to prioritize. I've been working with schools since 1989, 1990, when I've got my master's in public advocacy. I was accredited in the AHERA K-12 program, which is our National Asbestos in Schools program. From that time forward, I've either been involved with asbestos programs, lead programs, drinking water programs, programs related to resiliency, our National Tools for Schools program, indoor air quality. And I'll tell you, I have presented from national leaders, state leaders, local school district leaders, in schools, as well as to special needs classes. I'm a believer in communication, and I truly hope that our workshop today will refresh some of you all and then also plant some seeds and foster some discussion. When you get back into your districts or state positions, whatever they may be, I'm hoping that this will foster discussion and asking questions about where are we at in this program. It's something needed. It's something that we're seeing more and more. Ben Franklin himself, everybody remembers Ben for discovering electricity with his key and being a great statesman and everything. But Ben was also a fireman, right? He was with one of the first fire brigades in the United States. And Ben, one of his famous quotes is something we all need to take to heart. I believe this through and through. And I think in my walking through 911 and many hazardous disasters out there, failing to prepare, we are preparing to fail. Okay. If we are not thinking about resilience to these ever intensifying storms, we're preparing ourselves to get blasted out, to have kids losing days in the classroom, to having internet systems down, to having just problems intensified because we didn't take the time in advance, which is something school administrators, I know we're all overworked, but looking ahead and just doing a little bit of planning and thinking ahead can make a huge difference. Here in Western North Carolina, when Helene hit, it was total devastation. Our mountain areas had already suffered tremendous rains. And so our grounds were made unstable. Okay. When Helene came in, our grounds were already saturated. And then Helene sat and dumped, 10, 15, 18 inches in a quick period of time of rain, which destabilized a great amount of our infrastructure. We had super highways collapse. We had bridges collapse. We had schools flooded. We had in Asheville, where the river comes through, it didn't just come up 12 feet up to the road level. It came up, 2 stories more, where 2-story buildings away from the river were flooded to their top. It was incredible. We had 31 school districts impacted by Helene, right? With in excess of about 76,000 K-12 students out of school a month or more simply from the results of that one storm. And while we're on this slide, I want to take this opportunity to say one thing a lot of people might not think about. And you can see the precipitation map. And to the left is Western Carolina, where the bulk of the rain came. Okay. Well, towards the middle of the map at the bottom, where there's the light green, Mecklenburg County, where I'm at, is in the lighter green box. We had part of our county taken out by the floodwaters. Okay. Because what happens is when things happen in the mountains or things happen upstream from rivers, all that water has to go somewhere. It ends up in the rivers, and it can take a day, 2 days, 3 days for that excessive flood water to work its way downstream, creating a path of destruction the whole way through. Don't think that because you're downstream from a storm that you're in the clear. That's not always the case. In fact, it can be devastating when these things hit. There's a very little bit of notice, and depending who's control of the river levels, where they decide to let that water roll makes a difference. And in the case of Helene, we lost quite a few structures here in Mecklenburg County. In a business context, okay, in a business context, we find that businesses that do not have a contingency plan or resiliency plan to respond to disasters, 40% of small businesses don't reopen after a disaster. The funding's just not there. People used to think FEMA would come in and be the knight on a horse and just save the day, and that's never been the case. FEMA would come in, they would coordinate resources, they would help find resources if we needed tractor trailer loads of water or tractor trailer loads of generators. FEMA could help with that stuff and even help fund some of that stuff. But they were never, it's never been the concept that FEMA is going to come in and save the day. Many people found out the hard way during Florence, for instance, that bridges that were blown out between their houses and the main road. FEMA would come in and fund a few grand, but it might cost double that or triple that to have those bridges replaced. FEMA was never in place to make us whole. FEMA was in place as a coordination agency and to help fund things and help educate folks, but never to come in and save the day. It's incumbent on our local communities, it's incumbent on our stakeholders to invest both human and fiscal resources into the planning of what are we going to do if something hits? And further, what type of thing might hit that might cause us grief in the long run? A year later, 25% more small businesses will close. Maybe they got a grant, but it just wasn't enough to come through. And 3 years later, as much as 75% of businesses without a plan will ultimately fail. Okay. Those are business numbers, but the same holds true for our academic sector. If, we might not call it a pure business failure, but I can tell you our students feel it when they're not in the classroom, when they don't have internet service at home to continue learning through distance learning approaches as we're recovery. So it's the whole moral here is simply take the time to plan, find out if your districts are engaged in planning, who is, and what's taking place. If they're not, it's time to start. There's so many different things taking place these days, whether whether it's unfunded federal mandates on academics or any of the hazards that we're finding. We didn't used to think about pandemic flu as being a real issue, but President Obama in 2011 did what was called the National Strategic Risk Assessment, where it was determined what existential threats existed to our nation. You can research that. It's called the National Strategic Risk Assessment. In that document, pandemic flu was listed as one of the top potential existential threats to our nation years before COVID, right? And unfortunately, when COVID was about to hit, when the proper buttons were pushed by people in proper leadership, in my opinion, they were received as political hit jobs, but it wasn't. Our national response system actually went into action, but the folks at the top were not familiar with it. And as a result, we saw a lot of other than our nation's disaster response protocols followed. In addition to that, most all of us have had active shooter training these days, and which is important, of course. Electric grid loss is just an amazing amount of cost, and one of the ones we're probably most familiar with is fire loss. But what about these natural disasters, climate disasters? I stopped arguing years ago what they're being caused by. Okay. We can argue it's a natural cycle. We can argue it's being caused by human pollution. I do have an opinion. It doesn't matter. What matters is nowadays everybody is agreeing they're happening. So what we're looking at here is my own backyard. When I was responding to about 18 communities on the Eastern Shore, first boots on the ground during Florence, my own house was hit. I'm a few hours inland, at least 3 hours inland. This is my backyard. My little tiny 4-inch stream, 4-inch tall stream, maybe 3 feet wide, came about 100-yard wide, raging river, literally. And I had about an 80-foot tree come down on my house. I was out responding, and lo and behold, a domino effect happened. The water came up, a tree came down, my own house was impacted. Was the county there to help? No. My house was not a priority for the county. Okay. And will our schools be priorities? To an extent, yes. Okay. But they're not going to be the only priority. And if they are a priority and we haven't done the planning to know what an incident command system is, to know who to talk to know where the resources are coming from, to know what resources are going to be needed, to know what staff we need to be dealing with. If we haven't done that work, it's going to be a failure for a longer period of time. Maybe not for you, maybe not for the district, but for the children. Ultimately, we're going to win, but we got to win for the children as soon as we can, if you're in the business and you're all about children. Presidential Policy Directive 8, National Preparedness. I mentioned earlier that our schools have always been part of the nation's national preparedness goal and the design of all the programs. However, schools have not been as active, if active at all. We haven't been at the table. And when we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Okay, there's an old political phrase. But the national goal itself is a secure and resilient nation with the capabilities required across the whole community, not just our fire departments, not just our police departments, who have received an overwhelming majority of the funds that were set up for these preparative grants, these grants to help with resiliency. As our police departments have been beefing up and been militarized, okay, those same dollars have been available to our school systems, but our school system staff and personnel and leadership haven't been aware of it. Everybody's, for the most part, in my experience, I don't mean to suggest that your district hasn't participated if it has, and that's a wonderful thing if it has. But in my experience in traveling the country and in response, schools have been the last at the table. In fact, when I had gone through my training, I'm trained in many disciplines, but specifically when I went through our preparedness training at the FEMA level, uh, part of the training was making the point, look, we want schools involved. We want more private sector involved. We want hospitals involved. You know, as our police departments and fire departments have bulked up, those funds were available for the respirators that our nurses and doctors and hospitals didn't have. Okay. People were just not aware of it because I hate to say it, but even though we're in a government capacity for the most part of folks here, there's still competition for resources, and there always has been, right? Those $500,000 trucks driving around, or those, $750,000 SWAT team outfits for little towns. They were in large part funded by funds that have been available for schools, but school personnel haven't been informed on how to do assessments, on how to develop the grant requests, or even that those funds were available. But again, our preparedness goal is across the entire community. When looking around for stakeholders, who are the stakeholders in a school district's resiliency plan? It's more than the children, the faculty, the staff, and leadership. It's across the community. Law enforcement, hazmat responders, elected officials, EMS, right? Public safety communications, right? Military, neighbors, private sector, and NGOs. Our stakeholders in these programs aren't limited to us, only us looking at each other with our already, with our time already over. I know school district personnel work hard. They work hard from day to night, every day. Maintenance personnel, everybody thinks summertime's fun for the schools. Excuse me, but maintenance and building personnel, their peak periods are when school's out. Okay. Schools are not sit back and take it easy places, right? So don't think that what I'm saying is putting more burden on you. It is trying to ask y'all to get involved in these programs, reach out to your local emergency planning within the community, within your counties. Typically the governor's office will have a roundtable for emergency response resiliency issues. Don't think anything I'm saying is pointing the finger at you and adding more time to your plate. Okay. It's adding more thinking, yes, and it's adding perhaps broadening your thinking process in terms of who can help your school district or your state program be more prepared to respond when these things happen, and they're happening more and more. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but at the federal level, we've divided disasters or threats and hazards into three common areas. One, natural or acts of nature, which human pandemic is in there, animal disease, earthquakes, space weather. There's theories out there that the Grand Canyon was, etched out by a tremendously huge sun event. Same thing with large canyons on Mars. Just saying, space weather, tsunamis, volcanic, technological. We've all heard of our hack attacks where they take over our school system's entire computer system and then demand a ransom. And also human caused, which could be various attacks of many kinds. So there's three basic types of threats and hazards. It's not all limited to climate. Being prepared is having actions that involve a combination of planning, resources, training, exercises what you've put together, and organizing to build, sustain, and improve operational capabilities. This is a variation of the Deming cycle as it's taught in business school. Plan, check, do, act, but within a preparedness or resiliency framework. I'm going to spend a little time talking about, what is it that we need to be prepared for? And I can tell you right now, in the Northeast United States and in the Southwest United States, we have different priorities. Prioritization is something that we do more at the local level. It wasn't done at the federal level. The framework was established, rolled out through the states, but then it's local planning where we decide, what are the threats and hazards most appropriate to our individual districts. We'll get to that in a minute. So once we know what to plan for, we need to know what our current capabilities are. What can we do today? Once we know what our current capabilities are, we need to do a gap assessment. What gaps exist between what we can do today and what we believe we'll need to do when disaster strikes, and it will. And finally, how can we resolve our existing capability gaps? This equation, there's no test. Don't get uptight about it. Your own risk management people maybe have variations of this, but basically, to determine what we need to protect ourselves from, once we determine what our risks are or what are threats that we feel are viable for our district, what we do is we take a look at the threat hazard times our vulnerability. What's the likelihood that it's going to happen, times consequences. How bad are the consequences? There's different levels of consequence. And is it a district-wide consequence or is it a school-specific consequence? But this basically gets us into defining risk so that we can then plan, okay? And you can find this at Be Informed. This is all part of stuff that's available online and out there. I'm doing not 30,000, but maybe a 10,000 foot view, trying to plant seeds here for folks to move on and get into the programs. This form is a basic hazard vulnerability and risk assessment form. On the left-hand side, we identify our assets and or operations at risk. This could be our pre-K centers, our if we have a central heating plant, our heating plant. It could be our athletic fields. It could be our academic facilities. It could be our administrative facilities. And what I'm about to show is flexible, and it's something that is not rigid. Your own safety, risk management, risk assessment staff or community resources will have something like this or can model something like this based on your own operational modes, your own policies, and what have you. So anyway, we identify the threats and hazards, and then we rank them based on likelihood and severity. So here's an example I put together, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can see I've put some of our assets that might be at risk, what the hazard is. There could be any multitude of hazards for each facility, by the way. What the scenarios are, typically we'll write those out in paragraph or even page form and attach in a document. What our opportunities for prevention and mitigation are. Then we get into our actually defining risk via probability, what impacts, what kind of existing mitigation we have, and then our overall hazard ranking. So if you work through this, I'm not going to take the time to do the math, but if you work through this, ultimately you'll see that I've come up with a numeric ranking for these sample examples of threats to a school district that I've made up for purposes of the presentation. You can develop your own systems, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty simple in the end, and I'd be happy to walk folks through this if you're interested offline at some point. Let's do a capability gap assessment. Let's determine what our current capabilities are, what they are today, and what they need to be. How do you do that? Well, we conduct field exercises. A simple one that every school district does is fire drills. When you do fire drills, you learn how long does it take to get everybody out of the building. That's an example of a field exercise. They're not only done for fires, though. They can be done for many different types of scenarios. And many school districts do a variety of exercises over time. Every school doesn't have to participate, but you can also do desktop reviews of existing data. There's disaster modeling out there. Also, post-incident debriefs. After you've lived through a disaster, having a debrief, lessons learned session also helps. What that ends up looking like is once you define your capability targets, where you want to be. For instance, in this scenario, we want every student in the district to have access to internet after a disaster. That's it. Well, where are we today? for this scenario, I've come up with, well, 44% of known district students have internet access that we know of outside the district itself. It's from their homes, basically. So what is our gap? Our resource gap is, from this assessment, this scenario, 56% of students are projected to need internet access that they're not going to have, right? What this ultimately leads us to is our budget resource request. This is a real simplified way of looking at a very large major program, what we've just gone through. Your police departments have gone through it, your fire departments have gone through it at higher levels, not at the rank and file, but they've gone through it. And any of them that have come up with sweet grants, and I'm going to call them sweet because they're sweet grants, right? These multi-million-dollar grants to militarize the police or beef up our fire departments. They went through a THIRA process. They went through a process to define all these things so that a budget request could be made to the funding agency. That's the 10,000 feet. I'm going to spend just, 5 or at the most 10 minutes going through just a couple of slides here on what it's like actually entering a disaster zone. And I don't think this will be a trigger for anyone, but if you haven't been through a disaster and you're particularly vulnerable for whatever reason, this is all property and homes and things like that I'm building. I'm going to show there won't be anything beyond that, but just in case, if anybody's particularly susceptible, you might want to take caution in where we're going. But for instance, here we see one of our principals here in the state was trying to get the water out of a school. It was 2:30 in the morning when they decided, hey, we got to go home. We'll deal with this in the morning. And when they woke up, the school was underwater. The buses were underwater. Okay. As you see, Dr. Alexander says, I couldn't get out of my neighborhood because there were so many trees down. And that part was really scary for me when I couldn't get out. Right. Well, that's what waking up in a disaster zone is like. You're not expecting it. You think you went home and you're just going to get in the car and go to work and answer the phone and deal with it. I evacuated. I was the point person for Department of the Interior when we evacuated their headquarters in DC. Everybody was out of the building for 3 days. No one knew it was coming. And, we had it set up. It was already set up. Significant brass could go to another building through tunnels underground and come out with their phones and computers working. Non-essential staff went home. Okay. That's because planning took place before the fact. You can't plan when you come in, when you're trying to get in, and that's what's at the school. So, situational awareness, be aware of what you're getting into. I'll talk about that a little bit. And, have your mutual aid agreements ready in advance. If your school district can't get fuel because your fuel tanks are underwater, you got to have a mutual aid agreement with a neighboring district or another district in the state who can get fuel to your buses if you're even going to be able to have school, just as one example. So here, disaster response. In terms of getting in, and these are my photographs responding on a federal level, first boots on the ground, going in to do initial assessments. I learned on the top left, you don't drive at night. I stopped driving at night after I heard the rivers raging. I got a call late. I went out on a deployment. It was dark. I had to get there. I heard the river raging. I couldn't get in. The trestle was blocked by trees. And I got out of the area. When I went back in, the road was gone. Okay. That river wasn't just loud. It was right next to me. If the road's blocked by water, is the bridge still there that's under that water? South Carolina, we lost a couple maintenance workers who drove through. Some locals moved some signs that said do not enter, and they drove right in and their truck went down into a river. The bridge was gone. Here's telephone poles that were being made. A whole lumberyard full of telephone poles rolled in over this street. And when the dam of that pond gave out, it took the road with it. These things, These things are the types of things we need to be prepared for if we're going to be resilient and able to respond after big storms or other disaster events. Once we get into a disaster zone, it can be very problematic. Again, I'm not showing people here, but what you're seeing, the X on the vehicle shows that a responder has checked the vehicle for people. People's trucks are river. Here you see a wheelchair that was underwater. Cars flipped over. This was in a town, this was a series of 13 towns in West Virginia that had never flooded. And these towns were underwater. And it was basically a total loss for a lot of people. Again, a couple better shots. If you've got any bridges to cross, the bridges might have been taken out. Here you can see a couple of bridges that when the water comes up, there's no mercy. Either the bridge gets blown out of there, or it might just be covered with debris. Here's another look at a dam that gave out, and the little creek, or not a creek, but a pond that was supposed to make a community look beautiful. You can see all the trees that were cut down from the forest to make that little 3-foot deep pond. But what it ended up doing was knocking out the road. And in this instance, the state said, we're not repairing the road until you have an engineer certify that your pond isn't going to let this happen again. That happened throughout a state that will remain unnamed for this period. Response, getting in, cascade effects happen. We think of floods as water, but many times in floods, we'll see gas stations erupt in fire. Or if there's if industrial farming is taking place in your area, what you'll find is the animals can't survive. And we've had instances where hundreds, if not thousands, of hogs or chickens by the millions, but hogs by the thousands, will float downstream, and where the water lands, the carcasses land too. These situations are beyond what you see on the news. The news only shows so much. They get a little bit of human interest and then they move on. Initial response, it can be days to weeks. Recovery can take years. When I was helping with the recovery in Florence, people were still out of their homes from Matthew here in the Carolinas. Waste streams can be anything, whatever. It can be chemicals. It can be fuel tanks. It takes about 24 hours before the mold starts to grow. Waste streams are an important consideration. Whatever was in the schools, whatever was in the industry that was upstream from you, could be in your schools, in your books, in your libraries, in your carpets. These things, if you don't think about them in advance, can be absolutely devastating. When the state shows up to help, whether it's the feds, the state, or your county, they will be using what's called an ICS, or Incident Command System. You need to know what it is. Somebody in your district needs to be part of it, and you need to be plugged in. Okay. You can't go to a liaison officer and expect to get support for safety or logistic or finance. Okay. When things go down and the ICS is deployed, your districts need to be involved with the incident command structure. 3 slides to go. In terms of school nurses in disaster, school nurses play a big role, and not just in medical, by the way. School nurses play a huge role. People are in shock after things like this happen. I mean, I took whole trainings on just how to deal with children in shock. Their toys are gone. Their baby dolls are gone. Everything they've ever owned, they're gone. So it's very critical. School nurses, and their resources are limited as well. And frankly, it's just as possible that a school nurse could be in shock after one of these things as anybody who went through it. So my heart goes out to school nurses. They have a big job, And it's important that leadership understands stress management, the stages of grief, and that understands that not only our staff and our kids, but our nurses and even responders can be in shock after one of these. It's not like what you see on TV with the concerned reporter out trying to get ratings for the night. It's a lot more human than that. I was a safety manager or safety officer for North Carolina Baptist Men. We had 12,000 trained volunteers. We would do classroom training, we would do hands-on training. And this is an example of a training where on the right, people are being trained in how to do a mass feeding operation. We had kitchens set up where we could do 30,000 hot meals a day, completely independent of any agency, any power source, any radio. We would light up a campus with Wi-Fi, show up with generators, show up with tankers, show up with potable water, and show up with enough food to do 30,000 meals a day. That doesn't happen without training. It doesn't happen without exercises. So in conclusion, I hope we didn't miss much if the internet went down a little bit. But in conclusion, I'd like to ask everybody to consider looking into your resiliency programs at the district level. Every county has an emergency management group set up. Trust me, go talk to your county leaders. There is a team. Make sure your school system is on it and that your people or person who is on it is an appropriate executive and not somebody who's at the bottom of the food chain or the bottom of the totem pole. Okay. You want to make sure that you got serious players involved in this planning. I don't mean to take away from anybody at the bottom of the totem pole. I do mean to emphasize the need to take this seriously so that when the requests come in for a drill or when requests come in for grant writing time so that you can seek some of the grant funding that will be out there, that you've got senior brass buy-in and they're willing to go forward with it and not just make this another unfunded mandatory or unfunded mandate that everybody knows we all get stuck with. No, we need to have brass involved. We need to have buy-in involved, and we need our state school systems particularly ready at the governor's table when the governor pushes the emergency management button. We need school systems at the table. We also need that at the county level. And ultimately, we need our school districts, our safety teams, our risk managers, our academics, all thinking about what are we going to do when we got 56% of our kids who want to go to school, we have remote learning available, but they don't have the internet. Just one example of thousands, folks. I think that'll about wrap it up for me today. Feel free to reach out, any questions or any thoughts. Looking forward to it. And I hope some seeds were planted today that will help our children and our education sector blossom. You know, our kids deserve it. Our school systems have been taking a beating for too long. Our budgets have been ever decreasing. We haven't kept up with inflation. And at the same time, we're seeing our infrastructure, our needs increase. You know, many years ago, our federal government knew we needed billions to update our school systems, and that's only increased, folks. So at the bare minimum, we should be able to do some planning so that the insult and injury to our children from the natural and unnatural disasters is gone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was excellent. Brian, there are two comments in the Q&A box, one of which you kind of addressed just after it appeared. It said, please address the role of school nurses in a disaster. And you did comment on it, and I wonder if you wanted to elaborate on it for the benefit of the questioner who's gave her name
Absolutely.
as Vanessa Forsyth.
When I would deploy as a safety officer to major disasters, we had a medical corps, not a nurse. Okay. My point is, a school nurse is someone with a big heart and someone with capabilities, but those are human capabilities and limited to one person. I mentioned the importance of recognizing people in shock, the importance of understanding that even the responders can be in shock during these things. Even our school nurses can be in shock. School nurses play a role, be involved in the school nurses will have a better understanding of what types of needs might come forth in terms of triage, if it's something that happened during a school day, for instance. But our medical corps, which I and my daughter as well took the medical corps training, not as medical professionals, but as first aid certified professionals to support our medical professionals. In a disaster situation, medical support is critical. It's fundamental. It's tantamount to moving from response into recovery. Once a disaster event is over, we immediately were into response, cleaning it up, finding who we can find, saving what we can save. But once that initial response period is over, we go into a much longer period of recovery. We're still recovering here from Helene, folks. Some news stations will occasionally talk about Western Carolina. We are still in recovery and will be. It's not gonna end for a long time. Some people will never be made whole. So in terms of medical, nurses should be at the planning table. Yes, nurses should, it should be understood that a single nurse is not a medical response team and can only handle so much. We need to have empathy for our nurses as well. So part of the planning process is, depending on what your priorities are, you might need to have some kind of medical response teams. Maybe it's your county EMS. Maybe it needs to go beyond that. For a while at North Carolina Baptist Men, we had a full hospital that we could deploy with operating rooms that we could deploy military style. It was amazing. We had a special crew just for that. That only happened because of planning and because of grants and because of people with big hearts.
All right. Thanks for that answer, Brian. Another question just came up from John Forster. What about including labor unions in the planning and response team? One big example was the response after 9/11. Do you have that, Brian?
I'm sorry, I went down for a sec. Could you repeat that?
Yeah, it was about involvement of labor unions as happened after 9/11. Do you want to respond to that?
Labor unions can be a tremendous help. Labor people have received training, their leadership have received training. In 911, and I'm just going to be frank, we saw how the lead government agency used very high level methods of analytical techniques to assess the air quality. Transmission electron microscopy was used by the agency to find out how its own staff and its own building were, but a lower level of response was used for the surrounding.
Or Brian, did you stop talking or is your sound gone off? It seems your connection is poor. John, shall we move on? We can come back to questions and answers after Joel's few words. Joel,
Yeah, that sounds
please go
good.
ahead.
Oh, thank you very much, Leslie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with all of you today for a few minutes. The previous presentations highlighted that all across the United States, we're seeing more frequent and intense weather-related events as the climate changes. We're seeing more frequent storms, more frequent and intense storms, floods, heat waves, wildfires, and the spread of infectious diseases like Lyme disease and dengue fever. Now, we're here today because, as you heard from Leslie at the beginning of this webinar, children are among the most vulnerable to the impacts of these extreme events. Children in schools in every region of the country are at risk, and planning for school
Yeah.
district resilience is essential. Now, as Brian Kasher really effectively illustrated, protecting schools certainly requires planning for and dealing with disaster impacts once they occur. But efforts to protect schools and to protect school children from the impacts of extreme events and climate change must also include anticipating, preparing for, and adapting to the risks to avoid future impacts. And it's important to recognize, again, as Brian alluded to, that there is a regional texture to these risks. The risks vary across the country. And for that reason, adaptation plans and efforts to implement those plans must also vary across different regions of the country. Put simply, one size doesn't fit all. Now, regardless of where your community and your schools are located, adapting effectively requires partnerships. Protecting children and ensuring healthy school environments requires an all hands on deck effort across all levels of government, federal, state, local, and tribal, but also businesses, academic institutions, and the wide range of philanthropic organizations and nonprofit networks like the Healthy Schools Network are essential partners in this effort. Now, the importance of these partnerships was highlighted in September 2023 at a White House summit on building climate resilient communities. And at this summit, the Biden administration released a national climate resilience framework. And it identifies initiatives that the federal government, the federal family, is already taking in partnership with states, tribes, communities, businesses, and philanthropic organizations to build a more climate resilient nation. And I urge you, if you haven't looked at it already, I urge you to take a look at it. A copy is available in the resources that are going to be provided to you at the end of this webinar. Now, adaptation comes at a cost. It isn't free. Adaptation planning and implementation requires resources. And sources of funding, tools, and technical assistance to support adaptation efforts have been available from all of the partners that I've alluded to. For example, at the federal level, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which were passed by Congress during the Biden administration, provided unprecedented resources to support the development of critical infrastructure like healthy schools, and to take aggressive actions to tackle the impacts of extreme events like heat waves and wildfires, the sorts of impacts we're seeing virtually every week now across the country. And I want to give you a sense for the magnitude of these resources. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law allocated approximately $1.2 trillion in total funding over a 10-year period. And the Inflation Reduction Act originally provided about $79 billion in supplemental funding, but Congress subsequently reduced that by about $22 billion. So the available funding came out to approximately $58 billion. But that's not a small amount of funding that's available. Now, how were these funds actually used? And again, I want to give you a flavor for what is possible. Many of the funds were used to develop healthier schools. For example, EPA's Climate Resilient Schools program helps school districts upgrade their buildings to advance health equity and ensure schools are safe places during a wide range of climate impacts, such as heat waves. EPA's Community Change Grants provided approximately $2 billion to support community-driven projects to tackle environmental and climate justice challenges, including mitigating the health risks from urban heat islands and extreme heat. Now, there was also recognition as all of these funds became available that applying for the funds is also a challenge for many communities, many underserved communities, many disadvantaged communities. So EPA also helped disaster-prone and disadvantaged communities apply for these grants through the Community Change Equitable Resilience Technical Assistance Program. That's a mouthful, and we fondly called it the TIC-TACs. Now, these are just a few examples of the many funding resources that are out there. But again, I want to emphasize for you that you shouldn't always be turning just to the federal government. Sources of funding are also available from all of the other partners I alluded to. But I also want to emphasize that support for school adaptation efforts isn't limited to funding. Once you get the resources, very often you need support to understand how to use the resources to plan and implement those plans over time. And tools and other technical assistance are in fact available from all of these partners to support adaptation and implementation. For example, NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer, which I checked is still online and running. NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer is a web mapping tool that you can use right now to visualize how sea level rise and flooding might impact schools in coastal areas. And I also want to identify for you that, as Brian indicated, training is very important. And EPA and other federal agencies over time have developed curricula for schools to help people understand the risks that are associated and posed by climate change. Put simply, you can't adapt to something if you don't know what the risks are. So the education piece is also really critical. So let me wrap up there. I just wanted to give you a very quick overview. And I hope this high-level overview of the importance of anticipating and adapting to the risks posed by climate change and extreme weather events is helpful. But I want to conclude by emphasizing we have an opportunity. By working together, we can strengthen community resilience to the risks posed by extreme weather events and climate change, and ensure that students are safe and that students are in safe learning environments. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back to you, Leslie.
Thanks, Joel. You know, you stimulated some thoughts, and I'm going to take advantage of my position to show a couple of the slides that I'd shown, but to emphasize what you were saying. So I'm going to share my screen, and this is exactly what you were saying, is that these disasters are increasing in frequency and increasing in intensity. And I suggest people look at the NOAA website and look at the fact that these disasters are occurring in increased frequency. But you also, Joel, mentioned that there's cost. And you mentioned that there should be funds for prevention. And you were talking about billions of dollars. And I want to show that each disaster here depicted represents more than $1 billion. So these are 27 disasters that occurred during the 2024 year, last year, and that each one cost $1 billion. So we're talking about, at a minimum, $27 billion expended. And if every year they're going to increase, we're going to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars more. And in fact, the amount has actually accumulated to trillions at this point. And so I just wanted to kind of pick that point up, and that if we could spend that amount of money in prevention, I think we could save over time. The other point you made, Joel, was about the different areas having different needs. If you just look at this map, you'll see, like in the Northeast, there's these winter storms and the fires in the Southwest, and there were like wildfires raging a few years ago on the whole West Coast. And the central part of the country, we have the tornadoes and we have the hurricanes and we have the droughts. So each area has different needs. So I think that I would like to emphasize that point. And then the last point you mentioned was about disadvantaged communities. And I really do want to go back to my slide on disadvantaged communities, because if you add climate change and you add the heat and you add the bad air and you add all the other disasters, you find the disadvantaged communities suffer that much more. So thank you, Joel. That was very stimulating. There is a question in the chat from Tracy Gregoire. Hi, Tracy. Good to hear from you. Tracy's asking, what are the best practices in preparing for and responding to chemical disasters that often occur during extreme weather events?
Brian, I'll turn that one over to you.
All right, Brian, you're on.
In terms of best practices, chemical related events, we do have a great number of best practices actually. Where I would start is the DOT guide to chemicals. What it does is it inventories all categories and most, at least families of chemicals. There's so many chemicals you can't have a pocketbook that has every chemical, but it does have every family of chemicals. You can turn to that book and it will describe for you the chemical properties of the subject chemical. Now, first, you need to know what chemical it is. So the way to know that is by doing an assessment of what's around the school district. I'm not going to get into, I could spend literally a 40-hour class just on that. But we need to know what chemicals are out there. Two, I'll use a tanker truck, for instance. If a tanker truck went over, there's going to be a placard on that truck. The placard will identify it won't for me or you without the book, but it'll identify what the nature of the chemical is, what the precautions are, how far you need to be upstream or downwind from it so that it doesn't get you. It will tell you the specific gravity. It will tell you, does it float or does it sink? Chemicals are of great deal of concern. What comes down the river that's gone through chemical plants brings that. That's why whenever there's a disaster, you do not go into the water. You have no idea what's in it, whether it's carcasses, whether it's chemical, whether it's animal waste, whether it's human sewage, you don't know. We stay out of that water. But you can go to the DOT and download or purchase their chemical response guide. It's just a little pocketbook, and that will give you a initial response assessment for each chemical, if not family of chemicals, that you can use as a starting point. Getting much deeper into that than that, I'd need to start going into personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, things like that, and it's just beyond what we're doing here. Let's go back and remember resiliency. The message that I think we're sending today, planning is where it's all got to start. You're concerned about a plant that's within a certain zone of your school or school district, then you need to know what's in that plant, which your fire department does know, and your resiliency team needs to go to work developing a plan. That would be where I believe we would start.
Thank you, Brian. Claire, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Brian and Joel. I wanted to follow up with Joel because one of the things that's happening in the real world here is a loss of funding, whether it's at, taking back money out of EPA, out of the education department. Maybe FEMA is not going to be as fast to respond. There are restrictions on what FEMA is able to do. If I read the paper accurately, something about not dealing with resiliency because disasters or whatever. So I'm really curious we're talking about the reality of a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago about how the system might work. But can you comment about what is happening today and how, there's another preparation problem here for schools, which is what do we access and how can we access it and what is there to help?
That's a great question, Claire. Let me start out by saying I haven't had an opportunity to look across all federal agencies, for example, to see what's happened to their appropriations for specific programs that are focused on resilience to extreme weather events and climate change. And those aren't necessarily the same thing. You know, agencies that have had funding removed because they're focused on climate change issues may still have work going on related to climate resilience. But right up front, let me say, I haven't had a chance to do that assessment of what's still out there. Having said that, there still are a lot of resources out there that can be identified. In addition, there are still a lot of programs, and this relates to one of the other questions that is in the Q&A. There's still a lot of programs out there that still require, like, for example, through grants mechanisms, through contract mechanisms, that people applying for the funds indicate how they are going to ensure that the investments, the outcomes of the investments, are resilient to the impacts of extreme events. So those sorts of policy initiatives, those sorts of requirements are still there. But the bottom line is, I think there's still a real need now, real time, to begin to assess across the entire federal family, as well as at the state levels, how many resources are still out there that can be used to increase the resilience of schools and school districts and communities to the impacts of extreme weather events, even if they don't want to allude to things like climate change.
Right. I really appreciate that. I think that's necessary. Some of our listeners may not realize that public school construction is the single largest form in dollars of public construction after highways. These are huge buildings all over the country. It's only 55 million children, you know. Our particular interest as Healthy Schools Network is making sure schools can stay open longer and safely, or post-disaster reopen safely and quickly to minimize the off time, the down days. We've all learned the hard way what happens when schools are closed, not just for a year, but more than that, or even 50 days or 60 days. It's a disaster for many children, and many families for that matter, has real economic impact in the community. So thank you so much for all of that. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Claire, may I add one other point related to your question, and then also respond quickly to another question that was in the Q&As. We've focused so much on what's available from the federal government, and I want to come back to not just that there are resources available from state government, for example, as well as from philanthropic institutions. But I think there's also a need, and this is where the education piece comes in. I think there's a need for anyone, any community that's investing money to support schools, school infrastructure, to be thinking about the importance of ensuring that those investments lead to outcomes that are resilient to the impacts of climate change. And I'll use a really simple example. If a school facility is in a flood zone, it's up to them to decide what to do, but they might want to begin to think about, over time, perhaps relocating that school facility into an area that will not be in the flood zone, not just today, but in the future, given projections of more frequent and intense storm events. So again, this comes back to the importance of partnerships and an all hands on deck effort. There's also responsibility on those in the school districts and in the communities themselves to be thinking about what these risks are and what they can do to make smarter investments. Very quickly, there was also, if I may, a question about what offices at EPA they can get more information about. I would suggest two offices. One is EPA's Office of Community Health, Office of Children's Health Protection, OCHP. It's a fantastic office. It's got great leadership, and they've done a lot to think about how to build more resilient school facilities. And the other is EPA's Office of Policy. A lot of the climate adaptation work was, and to some degree still exists, in the Office of Policy, and I would approach them as well. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. That was very, very helpful. I'm sorry that we can't get to all the questions and comments because we're running out of time. We only have 5 minutes to go, and I want to just thank everybody for coming and participating and stimulating presentations, Brian and Joel, and thank you, John and Claire, for setting this up. And I just want to hand over to John to wrap up the last 4 minutes. John?
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel, Brian, and you, Leslie. That was terrific. I just wanted to make 2 quick announcements. One is we will send by email the link to the presentations and a lot of additional information. Some of you asked for additional information in the Q&A. We will wrap that all into a document for you and send it out this afternoon. Second, at the beginning, before the beginning, there was a countdown video. And in case you missed it and you wanted to see it, we thought we could put the video back on. This is a video that Brian, our featured speaker, Brian Kasher, had put together with exclusive footage of the Helene damage in North Carolina and interviews with responders and school officials. So Innie is going to put that up. And with that, we are signing off. Enjoy. I guess that's the wrong word for a disaster video, but appreciate the video that you're about to see, and look for our email later today. And thank you for coming.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, it's Brian. I'm about, I don't know, I'm on my way north. Big trees down there, where people have not been getting supplies. I've got a truckload of paper goods, diapers, adult diapers, baby formula, water, food. World Kitchen saw me loading up and put about 60 to 100 hot meals in here. I'll be delivering shortly. Shovels, hygiene supplies, cleaning supplies, just anything and everything. Gas cans. Surprisingly, they were asked for empty, so my assessment is that the local fire department's going to issue their reserve through these cans so people can keep their generators running until power gets put back in. I understand you're here on a mutual aid agreement, and your department is supplementing Boone's police department. And can you just give me a little sense for what do you see going on here? And by the way, thank you for coming out.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's been amazing. We came in here to Boone, North Carolina on Monday. We were from Havelock Police Department, Havelock, North Carolina, so we're over 5 hours away. And I'm friends with the police chief here, and so I reached out and he needed our assistance to help with his staffing. So we came in, and our primary goal is just to supplement their police department. We're working at all these different distribution sites just to add security and just to help where we can.
Wow.
And so it's been amazing. What I've seen is as this all these different food, water, diapers, just everything that is needed in disasters, they're coming in. You can see this 18-wheeler that just pulled in behind me, and you know, today's already Thursday, but this has been going on since before I got here on Monday. And what I've experienced is just seeing people from all over the state. They're creating their own distribution points, bringing that material here, and it's getting housed at this facility. And just as soon as it gets here, we'll have other shuttles come in, and they're taking it out to the rural areas, to the rural fire departments, or some of those other distribution sites. And then it's getting taken and going even deeper into the mountains.
That's a beautiful thing.
Fascinating network from the coast of North Carolina all the way up into the mountains and other states. I've seen all other states coming in. So it is amazing how friendly people are, how helpful people are. I've been here for 4 days, and I haven't seen a bad attitude or anyone rude or yelling at each other. We've been talking about it the whole time they've been here. They're feeding us good. You know, everybody's helpful, and everybody is literally giving the shirt off their back to help these folks. And the volunteer efforts, as I've stood here every day, you'll see just carloads of people coming up and just saying, how can I help? And so they're just coming in, volunteering, they're stacking food, they're loading cars, they're unloading that truck right now. So it's been amazing to watch as these volunteers just have rolled in day after day after day.
Well, thanks for coming, brother, and thanks for your police department. The amount of gratitude, it just can't be expressed. Thank you so much, and many blessings to you.
In places like Yancey County, the impacts on education from Helene continue to be tremendous. This is the former Micaville Elementary School. It's one of the schools that's been forced to close completely due to damage from the storm. But even at the schools that have stayed open, educators say they've never seen students this disrupted in a school year, and that includes COVID.
This will be the first full 7-hour, 5-day-a-week since before the hurricane.
For Western North Carolina educators like Darren Williams, there's no blueprint for how to shepherd a school and its students through a catastrophe like Helene or the learning loss that's accompanied it.
We had students who lost family members. We had students who lost houses. We had teachers who lost everything in their house. We had one middle school student who didn't make it.
The principal of Mountain Heritage High School in Burnsville, Williams saw his high school transformed into an emergency operations center after the storm.
Teachers at heart just want to help. And so our teachers were just diving in, going to check on kids, driving here, driving there, making lists, taking supplies.
According to a preliminary state report, the storm caused $573 million in direct physical damage to school facilities, grounds, and property, and more than $860 million in damage overall. In Yancey County, students missed 34 in-person learning days after Helene and another 15 due to winter weather.
It was hard balancing school and then the year and then the hurricane and then we was out for snow and then you got to balance your grades and then it was a lot at once.
Students like senior Croy Silver have tried their best to stay on top of schoolwork, but say it's been an eye-opening year.
Once everything kind of got back to a little bit of normalcy, it really helped with that.
But that time lost still has parents like Maria Yumalagova, whose 2 daughters have already lived and learned through COVID, concerned.
Some people say, it's the same like COVID. I don't know, because the whole world is moving and you're stuck here.
Yeah.
Just your kids are not going to school, don't educate anymore, don't communicate anymore.
For Maria's eldest daughter, a high school sophomore with college aspirations, the future is bright, but 50 days out of the classroom have created new questions.
They're missing the school and they said, oh, everybody's gonna pass. But I said, this is not a question if they pass or not. The question is the knowledge they're gonna have or not.
But in the halls and classrooms of Mountain Heritage High, a school that, at last, is once again a school, that's a challenge educators like Darren aren't taking on alone.
You know, we're going to catch up. We're going to learn what we need to learn, but people just, they just really work hard to help each other.
It's certainly been a community effort getting back on track, but it's one that administrators, teachers, and students in Yancey County say is emblematic of these mountain communities. In Micaville, Sean Coffey, ABC 11, Eyewitness News.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Hello, I'm John Reeder.